Ilia Topuria. Ilya walked in like a silent lion, dethroned the king of the featherweights, and whispered to the whole world that a new era had begun. Ilia Topuria's story is one of the strangest, most audacious in modern UFC. He's more than a fighter, he's the embodiment of his own belief. Even before he came to the UFC, he acted as if he was already a champion. He didn't just talk, he roared. When asked, he didn't say, "No one can beat me." He said, "I am already the next champion, I just need to prove it." This wasn't arrogance, it was an unshakable belief, and every one of his fights became proof of that belief. His fights weren't a show, they were a mission. He brutally tore his opponents apart as if it were a divine task. His fight against Alexander Volkanovski was one of the biggest shocks in UFC history. Volkanovski was the undisputed king of the featherweights, a legend who hadn't been defeated for years. But Ilya didn't feel any fear against him. Throughout the match, it was as if he was fighting himself, not his opponent. And then, that perfect right hand came. Volkanovski fell to the ground, and the whole world fell silent for a moment. He didn't just win a match, he ended a dynasty. He redefined the sport. And then, with that arrogant, self-assured attitude, he looked into the camera and said, "I am the best fighter in the UFC." This wasn't a promise, it was a prophecy. Ilya's story isn't about a dream becoming reality, it's about reality creating a dream. Islam Makhachev. Islam is more than a fighter, he is the bearer of a legacy and a tradition. He has inherited Khabib's throne. If Khabib's story was a force of nature, Islam Makhachev's story is the continuation of a dynasty. He grew up in Khabib's shadow, trained with him, and prayed with him. When he came to the UFC, he was referred to as a new Khabib, but he proved to be much more than a copy. With the same weight class and a similar fighting style, he carried the same brutality and the same cold-bloodedness. But his story wasn't just about physical strength. This was a story of tradition. Every one of his fights seemed to be done to honor Khabib's name. His championship win against Oliveira was the biggest proof of this. Charles Oliveira was the king of the lightweights, a monster. But Islam didn't feel any fear against him. He took him down, choked him out, and knocked him out. He didn't just win a match, he took over a legacy. This isn't just a fighter's story, this is the story of a family, a culture, and a tradition. Islam was more than a fighter, he was an ambassador. He reminded the whole world that Dagestan is still the most dangerous place in the sport. Dustin Poirier. Dustin was more than a fighter, he was a warrior. He was a man who always came back after a loss, a man with an unconquerable spirit. Dustin Poirier's story is one of the most touching in the UFC. He was never the strongest, fastest, or most technical fighter, but he always had the best heart and the best spirit. He always came back when he lost. When he lost his first match against Conor McGregor, he was referred to as a loser rather than a fighter. But he came back. He came back as a stronger, better, and smarter fighter. His second and third matches against McGregor were the best proof of this. He slowly tore McGregor apart like a fighter and eventually knocked him out. He didn't just win a match, he took revenge. Dustin's story isn't just a fighter's story, this is the story of a man who surpassed his own limits, faced his own demons, and always came back. He turned from a loser into a legend. He is the biggest story in the UFC. Conor McGregor. Conor is more than a fighter, he is a pop culture star, and his fights are marketing tools for his own brand. Conor McGregor's story is the biggest story in the UFC because he completely changed the sport. He entered the fight game like a rap star. Expensive suits, luxury cars, a confident walk, and most importantly, a mouth. He didn't just knock out his opponents physically, but mentally too. Remember his knockout of Jose Aldo in 13 seconds. Aldo was a legend who had been undefeated for a decade, but Conor got into his brain. He provoked him in press conferences, mocked him, and made him look like a coward. And then, when the fight started, Aldo was filled with rage. That was his mistake. Conor waited like a hunter, and then, in an instant, that magical left hand came. Aldo fell to the ground, and we watched a legend disappear. He didn't just win a match, he ended a career. Conor's fights weren't just fights, they were a show. He wasn't just a knockout artist, he was a storyteller. Every fight was like a movie. His lightweight championship win against Eddie Alvarez proved this. He beat Alvarez like a boxer, slowly tore him apart in the octagon, and eventually knocked him out. He became the first UFC fighter to be a two-division champion at the same time. And while doing it, he looked completely cool. But his story wasn't just about victories. When he became the biggest star in the UFC, his own ego took over. He began to self-destruct. Injuries, scandals, everything derailed his career. But still, he's a star. He's the biggest story in the UFC. He turned the sport into a show that shook the whole world. He is still the biggest draw. He's not a fighter, he's a phenomenon. Georges St. Pierre. GSP was more than a legend, he was a symbol of wisdom and respect. He was one of the most dangerous fighters in the octagon and one of the greatest gentlemen. GSP's story is proof of how a fighter can reach the highest peak. He was more than a fighter, he was an artist. He didn't just win fights, he slowly tore his opponents apart like a master strategist. His fights were like a painting. Every punch, every kick, every wrestling move was perfectly balanced. His fights weren't a show, they were a lesson. His fight against Matt Hughes was the beginning of his transformation into a legend. By defeating Hughes, he ended an era in the UFC and began a new one. His fight against Nick Diaz was a psychological war. Diaz tried to provoke him, mocked him, but GSP never reacted. He just waited. And when the fight started, he slowly tore Diaz apart like a child. This was the best proof of GSP's genius. He showed respect to his opponents after the fight, shaking their hands. This was the best proof of his character. He was the biggest story in the UFC because he was more than a fighter, he was a gentleman. He made the sport a better place. Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib is a force that doesn't just fight opponents but erases them from the concept of freedom itself. To understand Khabib, you have to go to those cold mountains of Dagestan, to that harsh culture of struggle. His story isn't a fighter's story, it's a hunter's story. The legend that he wrestled a bear as a child didn't come from nothing. He represented nature, not a sport. When he came to the UFC, he was a stranger. He didn't talk, he didn't put on a show, he just walked slowly and hunted his opponents. He didn't just take you down, he took away your will, your breath, and most importantly, your hope. He applied so much pressure to an opponent's face that the opponent had to beg for permission to breathe. His fight against Conor McGregor was the best example of this. Conor mocked him, mocked his family, but Khabib never reacted. He just waited. And when the fight happened, it wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Conor was taken down not as a fighter but as a prisoner. Khabib took him down, talked to him as if he were a disappointed father, and then literally tore him apart. And then when he jumped out of the cage to attack Conor's team, that was just part of the fight. That was the whole thing. He redefined the sport. And when he retired at 29-0, you know no one wanted to be number 30. That was a terrifying thing. Khamzat Chimaev. Khamzat entered the octagon like a hunter, destroyed his opponents one by one, and whispered his name to the whole world, "I will rewrite the rules of this game." Khamzat Chimaev's story is less of a rise and more of the arrival of a storm. When he stepped into the UFC, no one knew who he was. But by fighting 2 matches in 2 different weight classes within 2 weeks, he caught the attention of the whole world. He was more of a monster than a fighter. He hunted his opponents mercilessly, like a predator. His fights were not like a UFC match, they were like a horror movie. His fight against Gilbert Burns was the biggest turning point in his story. Burns was a monster, a championship contender, but Khamzat didn't feel any fear against him. He took him down, punched him, choked him. This fight was not just a match, it was a parade. When Khamzat defeated Burns, he showed the whole world that he was the next big star. Jon Jones. Jon entered the octagon as God's chosen warrior and became a figure who fights his own demons. He mesmerized everyone with his long reach, razor-sharp elbows, and a cold-bloodedness that mentally tore his opponents apart. When he defeated Shogun Rua and won the championship belt, he was seen as a legend in the making. Even strong opponents like Cormier were helpless against his intelligent and brutal fighting style. However, his life outside the ring was a complete contrast to his genius inside it. Scandals, drug issues, and car accidents shattered his good kid image. The most terrifying thing was that while no one could beat him in the ring, he was constantly trying to defeat himself. When he changed weight classes and became the heavyweight champion, it was less of a comeback and more of a final legendary act. Jon Jones's story is not just a fighter's career but the saga of a man's relentless struggle with his own nature.